just before we turn to Russia, I was caught by something you've written this morning, which, with a map, shows Germany is actually 3 different countries, having voted decisively differently. That may be pregnant with some problems for the future, don't you think?
Indeed, and as we're going to discuss maybe in a moment, Russia in some ways is a different country in 3 or 4 different places as well, electorally. I mean, the communists, for example, are stronger in the middle of the country. The nationalists are stronger in the east of the country. The Pro Putin party is stronger in the south. I mean, you know, it works in different ways too. But yeah, just looking at Germany today, and I mean, Germany is a country I know reasonably well. It's a very stark, there's obviously some nuance in big cities, but in general, you know, around the country, that the south is very conservative and Catholic, the north is liberal and left-leaning, and then the south of what used to be East Germany, the area around Dresden and stuff like that, Leipzig, that's voting very heavily for the AfD, which is the far-right party. And of course, there are nuances in the major cities. Obviously, as you know, cities are always more liberal than towns. I mean, just the way life is. And you will see, for example, that even in the conservative Catholic south, the Green Party have done well in Stuttgart and Munich, you know, and you will see, for example, that the Die Linke, the far left party, have done well, for example, in parts of Berlin and in, you know, in Dresden city, for example. But overwhelmingly, yeah, you're right. And it's very similar in Russia, George, and this is something that nobody in the UK would talk about, in England or Scotland, is that there's a kind of notion that Russia is, you know, uniformly sort of pro-Putin or uniformly, you know, a similar country, even though it's the biggest country in the world. That's not the case at all. For example, the Communist Party did very well in Moscow, the capital, whereas they didn't do so well in St. Petersburg to the same extent as they did in Moscow. The south of the country, particularly the Islamic regions, are very heavily pro-Putin's party, United Russia. That might surprise people, for example, that might have thought, you know, because of Chechnya, the war years ago, that maybe the Muslim regions would not be so supportive of Putin. And then, you know, there's the east of the country where the communists did very well this time, and historically the far-right LDPR has done very well over there. And then you'll also find pockets of communist support in the industrial regions near the Ural Mountains for obvious reasons, because, you know, the workers and the unions and whatever might, you know, lean towards the communists. But yeah, the fact the communists did so well in Moscow is interesting. And what's happened is that the Western media, the British media, particularly Financial Times and other outlets like that, have tried to, and the Independent most notably, actually, which ran a piece the other day that was just bizarre. They have basically tried to make it sound like the communists have won, well, not won, have made gains because they were supported by Alexei Navalny. Now, here's what happened, George. In the weeks building up to the election, the Communist Party were polling very, very strongly. And one poll actually showed them in the mid-20s in support, but generally, at the start of the campaign, they were on 12 or 13%, and they kind of got up to an average of around 20, which is where they got, which is obviously a considerable swing. I mean, to go from 12 or 13% to 20 in a couple of weeks is obviously a swing of 50%, basically, you know. And 2 days before the election, Alexei Navalny's people issued this list they call smart voting. And smart voting basically was, we want you to vote for these candidates because they got the best chance of defeating the United Russia candidate in their constituency or in their area. And like, obviously, because of the swing to the communist candidate was obviously the most likely to, you know, win in or come second to Putin's party, the pro-Putin party, in most of the country. So what the Navalny team did was they released this list and they said, vote for the communists, basically. And now they're trying to take credit for the communist gains. And even though they did it 2 days before the election and the communists had been building in the polls for, you know, 3 or 4 weeks or even longer. And what's happened is that some of the stenographers in the British media have basically tried to present it as victories for Navalny-backed candidates as opposed to victories for the communists. I mean, this is the kind of narrative management you're dealing with, because they don't want to say the C word, because obviously if they run stories saying, wow, the communists have made big gains, a lot of the people in Britain, for example, or America, who don't like Vladimir Putin, well, they definitely don't like the communists either. So, I mean, for historical reasons, as you know.
fascinating. Even I had no idea of some of that detail you've just given us. And we certainly won't find it in the Western media, and for the reasons that you have adumbrated.